Phronesis. Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this beautiful world. My name is Scott Allen, and I am the host of Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. I am an associate professor of management at John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio, USA. I'm an author, an entrepreneur, a speaker, a nonprofit founder, and the host of 2 podcasts. I'm also a husband and dad of 3. You just heard from Kate, my daughter, who wrote and performed the Phronesis intro. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion on all things leadership. My guests are scholars and practitioners, and we cover timely, relevant topics and incorporate practical tips designed to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Now, I am proud to share that Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association, an association that is near and dear to my heart. ILA brings together leaders and those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ilaglobalnetwork.org. If you like what we're up to, please click subscribe so you can stay up to date as we release new episodes each week. You can also share what we're up to with others. And now, today's show. Okay, everybody. Today on Phronesis, we have Bruce Avolio, and this is a conversation that I have been looking forward to for a long time. Bruce, in front of you right now, I have Leadership Development in Balance. I have I'm going to go back to the day, full leadership development. And if I could be in the room with you, you would see my dog ears and my Post-its and my markups. And you are an individual who has, for decades now, just been incredibly prolific. And so I am so excited to have you with us today. For our listeners, Bruce is at the University of Washington. He's a professor of management, and he is the Mark Pigott Chair in Business Strategic Leadership. So, Bruce, Akron, right? I'm in Cleveland, and so I don't know what was going on in the water in Akron, but maybe it was the water Bob Lord was having you drink. But David Day, Bruce Avolio, Bob Lord, I mean, so much incredible thinking has come out of that program. I would love to hear a little bit about that if possible, but how did you develop this interest and this passion for studying leadership? Could you take us back?
Sure. Well, I was born in New York City. Okay, not that far back. Okay.
Mama always said I was influential on the playground.
That's it. You just have to have a good mother. That's it. Father.
We're going to go Zalesnik on us right now. Huh?
Yeah. As fathers, we're vestigial structures. We can hang around for a while, but we're like the appendix, or tonsils. Eventually, if you get rid of them, you can still, move on. So if I go back to graduate school, actually a little before graduate school, I wouldn't say that I had this passion all my life to study leadership or observe leadership. But I did find that I was interested in early in high school, probably before high school, in reading things about people who have taken nations and other organizations and organizations in directions that I would hope we could not see happen, but does. And in particular, my mother was from Poland and Jewish, and they immigrated to the United States. And like a lot of people that went through that experience, I had Linda Trevino actually in my class talking about both of her parents are Holocaust survivors. My grandparents came to New York, and I grew up in that tradition, even though my name's Avolio, and that's the other half is my Palermo father, Italian, Southern Italian.
Yeah.
But I was very interested in, how do places go wrong, in terms of following leadership in these directions that oftentimes lead to destruction. Yeah. So I started reading that stuff, and then I just, didn't think about leadership for a while. When I got to college, I didn't major in anything until my senior year because I really wanted to just explore things and didn't have any particular interest. And then my senior year, I took a course in industrial psychology, and I thought, this is interesting.
Yeah.
I think this is something I might be interested in pursuing. My girlfriend broke up with me. I thank her all the time. That led me in my great career plan to the University of Akron, which was I applied to two places. I got in at both, but it was a last minute decision.
Yeah.
And I got in my 65 Rambler Classic, and I drove to Akron, Ohio. And I
Wow.
started there. And what was interesting about that is, in many ways, I was very lucky because the people that had gotten there, some of whom had come from the University of Rochester, because the University of Rochester had shifted from being more behavioral to much more of an economically focused business school.
Ah.
And that has relevance because people like Gerald Barrett and Ralph Alexander, later Bob Lord, came on board from Carnegie Mellon, and others, many others. When they left and went to Akron, they decided that they were going to become the number one industrial psychology program.
Yeah.
And for the next 5.5 years, we all went through the pain of doing that. If you're going to get to the Super Bowl, you know what? It's going to be a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it was an incredible experience. And I wouldn't say I was interested in leadership at Akron. I was actually interested in development.
Okay.
And so was David and many other people, because at Akron there was this quirky professor who I love by the name of Harvey Stearns. And Harvey Stearns came out of Morgantown, and this whole lifespan initiative was
Yeah.
starting.
Yeah.
Kay Warner Shy and Paul Baltus and others. And I was like fascinated in my first class to hear that as you get older, you get more different from each other.
Yeah.
So, you have people who run marathons that are 95 years old and disappointed they didn't get a good time. And you got people who are not even ambulatory.
Yeah.
And so I never realized that until that moment. And it triggered in me an interest in looking at development. And that kind of just incubated until pretty much my last year at Akron, when I decided to come back to New York and work at SUNY Binghamton. And Bernie Bass was there. And Bernie Bass was actually at Rochester. So this is a long roundabout way
Oh, really?
of saying that Bernie Bass went to Binghamton, Barrett and others went to Akron. And when there was a job opening there, Barrett had contacted Bernie and said, I have this guy, Bruce Avolio, coming out. He's really interested in lifespan development. Would you be interested? And Bernie was. And so I ended up getting a job there. And
Wow.
then that started the beginnings of being interested in leadership. Long story.
No, I love it. It's fun to hear that story. And I didn't realize that Bass had been at Rochester at Simon. And
Yep.
okay, so that's really, really interesting. And this, you just triggered something in me, because you had an interest early on also. And was it in gerontology? Am I grabbing that from some unknown place, or is that accurate?
No, well, you've now brought me out into the open, because I've been very fortunate to work with some really great people in my career, and I've won certain awards, from the industrial organizational psychology from American Psychological Association, and a lot of times people refer to me as an industrial psychologist, which is complicated enough for most people to understand, because psychology and industry, how does that go together? Just make people happy, right? But I actually was the first industrial gerontological psychologist to come out of the first program focused on that. That I jointly developed. Never do this as a doctoral student, because I said 5.5 years and it was actually 6. Because we created a program that combined everything between lifespan development and industrial psychology. So that's really what my degree was in. So I'm a complete fake. I'm not an industrial psychologist. But who cares at this point, right? It's time, Scott, it's time to come out.
Oh,
But I
Well,
have to say,
it
yeah, I'm sorry, it really
no,
benefited me because I had a very different frame of reference in how I looked at leadership, and people like David Day, who was a little bit behind me, not much. He had the same reference, and a lot of things that I've read of his. It's like, man, I remember that discussion, and or hearing that from some of the developmental people on our faculty, and also the industrial. They actually, it was a good linkage there.
well, it that interest, it shines through in leadership development and balance, right? Where you're talking about live stream, and how do you reflect on some of that content now?
It's more complicated than I thought,
Oh,
or had
will you say
hoped.
more about that?
Yeah, it deals with, it gets down to the neuronal level today. Looking at how the brain, matures and how it develops and what experiences shape the way we process things. And we still know a fraction, people who really know this stuff, the neuroscientists know some more about it than we do, but we are going to discover some things there that I think is really powerful, as well as the heritability and genetic part of it, which is still, from all the data, not the majority, actually probably a third at most. And even there, the geneticists say it's crazy to think about genetics separate from the engagement in environment and evolution. And evolution's another piece of that we tend to see in people, things that have been put in early on before they existed, those individuals. So we can go back through time and see how some of these things get transported into our heritable genetic structure, and then eventually, we see it as, that's how you behave, that's how you think, that's how you emote. So it's more complicated, and then I haven't really included the context, and that has been more of a revelation even since writing that book. That the context is so important to how people evolve and engage. All you got to do is see what's happened in this last year. We have had this grand experiment, and we don't know yet what the outcomes will be. We don't know what's going to come out of this Teams, Zoom, WebEx, whatever environment and end up in the same room together. And so things like this have happened throughout history that are kind of jolts. It's a whole nother level of complexity to this whole process of development. So it's more complex. Although there's some things early on, I have to say, that I remember being in a meeting with a head of IBM training, which happened to be near Binghamton University. It's where IBM had their training facilities at the time. And I made the comment, why don't we start leadership training with the followers? Wouldn't it be easier for leaders if we train the followers first? He didn't quite ask any follow-up questions of me after that. But frankly, that has become a significant part of how we look at the whole development process of leadership. The
Yeah.
three-legged stool: the leader, the followers, peers, and context.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by it's more complex. So
Yeah.
it's definitely more complex.
Well, Kellerman calls it, she calls it what, the leadership system. And I think we could, I don't know, disagree with this if you do, but we could probably go back to Fiedler, where he's starting to look at, a few different dimensions of everything. And so I've noticed that you've added in some of your more recent work, some work on the context and also some more interaction with followers, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Talk a little
absolutely.
bit more about the complexity of the individual. What I would love to do, one of the papers that you wrote, and I asked you in passing at a conference once. It was Avolio and Gibbons, but you all go deep into, some Keegan and adult development. And how are you thinking about some of that work? You get into the Kunert and Lewis and some of that work. How are you thinking about some of that today? Is that more
Uh,
complex too?
well, it was complex when even early on. That when I read Keegan's book, who I've gotten to meet and know a little bit through some conferences at Harvard, and he's a great scholar.
Yeah.
I'm really a fan of his immunity to change work too.
Yes,
It's just
yes.
some really smart stuff about how you think about changing organizations. But in his book, we're in over our head. I love the in the beginning. He has comment from his mother, which is basically, "Who could read this stuff?" I didn't know this is what you wrote, but who could read it?
It's a little thick, yeah.
It's a little thick. So it started out complex, but it's dealing with what I would consider maybe still the holy grail, around leadership development. And that is our perspective taking capacity and the way we construe things. And, you look at, Bob Lord's work and the arc of that over time and how much of that has gone into now those areas, including around identity, and people look at moral identity and all those sorts of things. Um, so I think for me, that has been sort of pivotal and has always kind of worried me that, we're training at a level that might not be really tapping into that sort of underlying, operating system that really, we can change behaviors. There's no doubt we can change people's behavior, but to change that level, at that level, that changes everything, the choices people make, or the decisions that they pursue. And going back to where I first started, how do people construe creating a society where everyone but a certain group is the only group that's relevant, and we've seen that throughout history. We're seeing it unfold today in the world in so many different places that create conflicts. So to me, it's a really important piece. The challenge has always been how to measure it, and that's really tough. Carl came to Nebraska and trained us on the subject-object interview. It was very enlightening. I started, going into meetings judging people based upon what stage they were at.
You're at
So,
stage two.
so that wasn't, yeah, yeah. I thought you were at stage three for Christ. No, I guess not.
I better
Darn it.
start saying fair, unfair, right, wrong, good, bad, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. But it's really always it's affected my thinking about when we go back to the hard stuff, the complex stuff. That's one of the really complex things is, how do you develop that, not just moral framing, but the way people frame things? And where does that come from? And there's all sorts of places it comes from. Like sometimes it's just serendipity. Someone drops in and says something to you, and you go, wow. And you think about it, and it's 20 years later, and you're still thinking about what that person said to you. I use an example where I met a person at a conference with Desmond Tutu, and afterwards I walked out. I never met her again, only met her because I was sitting next to her. As we walked out, she said, that was really amazing. There was so much love in the room. And she said, it's a really good time for me because I'm recovering from cancer. And then she turned and said, but cancer is the best thing that ever happened to me. And then she left. The crowd kind of enveloped her, and I was like, what? And I've heard people tell me that many times, actually, that there are certain things like that or cancer that people have gone through. And if they survived it, they said it's one of the best things. And I'm like, God, can't leadership training be easier than that? I mean, but it does change people's frame of reference. It rocks the world.
Yeah, I watched a TED Talk Iger the other day, and I'll put it in the show notes. But yes, it's some of those moments that facilitate what Mezirow would call it maybe a disorienting dilemma that can foster or facilitate some of these transitions in levels. And back to the context thing, I'd never thought of it this way before. I'd just love to get your thoughts on this question. But when we think about the context, I had a really interesting conversation with a gentleman named Jonathan Reams. Jonathan is the editor in chief of the Integral Review. Okay. And he's at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And we were talking about some of the differences between the States and his experience in Norway. But he was talking about a pretty intense focus nationally on developing the moral character of the citizens. in some of these schools. And that really struck me when we think about the context, about how even our environment is training us to be seeing the world and viewing our experiences. It's starkly different than maybe what your average US citizen experiences. So, does the context in some ways facilitate or stunt our progression through those stages? And I think the answer would probably be yes. I mean, that's possible at least. How do you think about that?
Well, when I've been asked how much time would you like to invest in, like, if we're going to bring you in to do leadership training, how much time would you like to invest in the training part? And I would say, how much time can you afford? And they would say, oh, well, I don't know. Today would be maybe, if you say a day or two, it's a long period of time. I said, well, I would like to have that day or two in short segments over a year. And my reason for saying that is because I think the context is so important to how people actually, their trajectory of development unfolds over time. So I think the context is really rich. My former doctoral students from Nebraska published a paper in Academy Management Review looking at how people, development is shaped by how you look across boundaries. One good example of that is, I think that there should be a requirement in the United States that people get a passport as well as have a birth certificate and a driver's license, and they're required to go to other cultures at least once a year to see where we are right now in terms of the arc of our development, and understand that different cultures have very different ways of framing. And what Rachel wrote about was that these cross-boundary experiences, just like the trigger event I gave you, that's, it's kind of thinking outside of my boundary, really shape our perspective in fundamental ways. And so many, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's pretty high in our country where people have never traveled other than going to a wedding in Mexico somewhere, where they're inside a walled-in resort, and they're interacting with all their family and friends and not really interacting at all in the culture. And I think that's a great example of how you kind of shape people's perspective in terms of the context. Obviously role models and, all the Bandora's work about, vicarious learning. How much vicarious learning accounts for, how much does leadership development can be attributed to vicarious learning? I think a lot. Especially if you have one thing working, reflection, where you stop and think about something.
Yep. Well, it makes me think of the statistic. I'm not sure if this is accurate. I'll put this in the show notes as well. I think the average U.S. citizen gets to just 4 states, let alone different countries. Right? And there's opportunity there because that leads to a very secluded existence in whatever context we're embedded in. And so I think let's talk a little bit more about time. Sometimes when I think about this work in leader development, and you gave it a beautiful example of, a company that says, well, we have a couple days. And sometimes when I step back and I think about what we're trying to accomplish in leader development, we approach it at times like it's a cooking class. Like we're going to have a 2-day cooking course, and all of a sudden we're going to have a chef after that's done. And most of the course is us sitting in a room talking about cooking and knife skills. Not actually practicing knife skills, just talking about the knife skills and the importance and the history of knife skills. And so when you think about how we approach leader development, not having a practice field much of the time, or at least a practice field where we can receive coaching. If you go to some of the Erickson, deliberate practice type work, there has to be a better way. There has to be a different way. Have you been thinking about this work in new and innovative ways that have struck you in recent years, or are you still struggling with some of that puzzle of, geez, how, the military is probably the closest where you have people embedded in this context for decades, and they're continually in this place of growth depending on rank. But when you step back and really think about what we're trying to do, um, time is invariable that we haven't necessarily figured out also, because it requires that time. How do you think about that?
Um, well, I think about it in several ways. I'll give you one way. I think there's a lot of potential here for innovation. Some of it coming from other areas or fields. But one thing is like looking at this as from a historical time perspective, right? I remember someone in China telling me back about 15 years ago, we've been out of it for about 300 years, but we're back. And when you think about 300 years in our country, it's like, well, that's about all, that's about all we got. But when you have that the benefits of iterations of time historically, it gives you some perspectives that I don't know if we're around in 1,000 years as a country. And given the way the world has evolved, I'm not sure that is going to be the case, but we'll see. That we're going to have a different perspective about things. We'll have gone through multiple iterations of events and situations that hopefully have evolved us, into something as a more perfect union, so to speak, as we talk about here in our country. Um, the innovative part. So I think of a historical context. I think my own personal history. It's like I have this narrative, and I think I lived in this channel, and it doesn't include yours until today. So I don't know what your historical context is and how they overlap with mine. And ours are both construed, right? History is construed. It's not as it happened. It's the way we've interpreted it. And then I look at, kind of the present time context and what's happening right now. And, developmental psychologists talk about event dense periods in history, right? So in the 60s, there was a lot of things that were happening that were impacting institutions and the way we saw things and so forth and so on. In the 70s, I don't know, we had bell bottoms and the Spinners, and that was about it. And then we went, then the 80s,
I get Led Zeppelin. That was pretty good.
Well, they were around the 60s too, but it just like there was these periods of events that the time is almost compressed. It's like it's happening at you so much. Like this year, okay, we've got pandemic, we've got multiple social injustice movements happening at the same exact time. And then in the last month or two, we bring in the Asian American experience, which has not been a very good history for us, nor for them in this country. And rightly so, it's coming. All these things are happening in this period of time, and the bifurcation of the political system, and et cetera, et cetera. So look at this and say, if I were to create a game, what would it be? And how could I get everyone playing the game? Well, the game right now is the world we're in, right? And we're all players in that game. Some of us have more resources than others, and we could do things to make an impact. What if we created something that was a simulation of that, but still had the basic principles of gaming? So if I were to create what I call a gamulation for engaging people in their own development, what would that look like? It would be a series of scenarios and challenges. Now, to go from pie in the sky dreaming, which I was always accused of in my elementary school, high school, that I was dreaming, not paying attention. But now dreaming is considered a strength. And I envision a world in which we can teach people through gaming principles how they might be able to engage challenges, working sometimes with not a few players, but thousands of players, millions of players. So and this is not pie in the sky. We got an NSF grant, National Science Foundation grant, and built an entrepreneurial gamulation. taking people through the typical founders' dilemmas that entrepreneurs love to regale you with. Oh, I have failed 3 times in my, and you're like, did you do the same things the same way each time? Like had one, company with your friends and a second company with your friends. And a lot of times they make the same mistakes, the typical mistakes. So we developed that. We've developed now 3 or 4 of them, 5 now, for different companies, and we've deployed them in universities. We've got one called Liberty Air, which is really based on Alaska Airlines experience going through a complete transformation as an organization. And we modeled that, and then we say, play it. They wanted to see how other people would play the game they actually played in reality, the real leaders of Alaska, and we made it into a game and simulation. So that's one innovation. If we can create the kind of stickiness that games create for education, and it's being used in other areas as well. It's being used in health. I mean, if you think about our lives, right? A lot of things are driven by game, like, earning points for flying. And I've had people say, I'm going to Spokane this weekend. It's like, where are you seeing family or friends? No, I'm just going there because I need one more leg in my, I get MVP gold if I do that.
Take a flight from Seattle to Spokane.
It's Seattle, Spokane to beautiful Spokane, and then come back just because they can do that and get extra. So we've been looking at how to use gaming. In fact, before you came on with this interview or podcast, I was finishing it's a 10-page paper that I'm using as a basis for a discussion. We have the Naval Command here, just north of Seattle. It's actually where a lot of our nuclear subs are based and so forth. And they're doing a conference on mental health, and it's part of Dr. Biden's initiative to bring wellness and mental health to helping families and service members. And so we're having a conference, and in that, I'm talking to them about some work we were doing on recovery from addiction. So here I am, this industrial psychologist, but really a gerontologist, lifespan development.
Who's interested in gaming.
Is interested in gaming, that knows hardly anything about addiction. But now I've spent a lot of time, and you mentioned Mesereau. I have his book right on my desk because I've been looking at transformative learning in contexts where you're dealing with addiction, suicide, things like that, because the mental health field is overwhelmed, to say the least. And there's no way we can produce enough mental health experts. So one of the proposals we have is that we have had in the works is to look at how we could use gamulations to bring in all of the stakeholders that can help that individual work through probably one of the most challenging things that people can work with, is getting off of some of these incredibly powerful drugs that is ruining lives, is causing high rates of community challenges, homelessness, people dying. It's just, so I look at that and I say, could gaming, isn't that kind of silly to talk about game? No, I mean, gaming is something that it could be a good addiction, not a bad addiction. So that's one example.
Well, it resonates with me in a lot of ways. So a passion topic of mine, and people who listen to the podcast have heard me say this before, are technologies enabling disruption. So that we could go down that whole rabbit hole, right? But outside of where I am right now, I'm in my basement, and my son plays. He has 2 hours a day, right? That's the limit on Fortnite. And so he has 2 hours a day. Well, what is he doing? He's putting on a headset. He's talking to 5 of his friends, and they are working as a team to accomplish some goal. And he has a couple other games that he's playing, but they're teams of 5. And literally, he's not playing right now, but I can hear him from here coordinating, strategizing, planning, saying, good job. I mean, if we could harness that, I don't know if UW has a gaming team, but it's really fascinating because I think that's an area. So your notion of gamification, I see it. I see it very, very clearly because I think you're exactly right. And I co-founded a leadership competition it was in 2015. And this spring, we had 33 teams from across North America get online, 310 people, two judges per team. One judge was, both judges were looking at process. We did the Everest simulation, Roberto and Edmondson. And so we had a team engage in that simulation. They had a process score based on a rubric we'd kind of developed based on the curriculum. And you would be just smiling how into this experience the students get because it's immersive and because they know that they're competing with other schools from across Canada or the US, and it's pretty fun. So the gamification, yes, I get it. And why do people practice? I think an Achilles heel of our work is that, well, where do people practice leadership? Practice. You have you have people in organizations leading right now, but oftentimes if we go to the Ericsson stuff, they aren't necessarily getting coaching and feedback. They might be practicing the wrong stuff over and over and over and not getting that data and that feedback. So we're trying to create a practice field. And what does it mean to coach leadership, or what does it mean to practice leadership? So we're dipping our toes in that. But the gamification, why do people practice? To compete or to perform? That's why I practice the cello. That's why I practice football. And when we think about the time that people give to football versus really developing their leadership skills, it's what? Thousands of times more time. So I love this whole stream, and how can technology and how can we leverage technology to help facilitate that learning, right?
Yeah. So can we make it as sticky as Fortnite? Um, the answer is yes. We've demonstrated that. I mean, SimCity is an example, for example, as one example. In fact, one of the people who developed that with his friends, his name, it's called AJ. He works with us on these gamulations. He also worked with Lucasfilms on the ranch on Star Wars, originally some of that, and he also worked at Microsoft, and he was the head of Xbox in Asia. So he brings together, he and some of the other people I'm working with, they bring together a wealth of experience that allows us to say we bring constructs into play, and they put the context into perspective, and then you pull those things together and try to keep it interesting. You could reinvent just about everything related to assessment and development. For example, certification exams, which just every year, like a real estate broker has to do a certification exam, and they hate them. What if they said, "I can't wait to do this year's to see what it's like."
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
This is kind of, you know, doing what we say all the time in business schools to be disruptive in terms of industries. This could be very disruptive at every level. And I think it's gaining more traction. You know, you're seeing it in use with kids on the autism spectrum now in terms of using gaming and other approaches. We have something that was developed here serendipitously called Snow World for our burn clinic, where when people come to this clinic, usually, you know, we're the first in the world to create a burn clinic, among a lot of other firsts at the university's med school. And when people come there, one of the worst parts of it, beyond being horribly burned, is when they have to take the bandages off and they have to give people morphine because it's so painful. Someone got this idea based on sort of distraction theory. If someone was playing a game while that was happening, I wonder what the experience would be in terms of pain. And so Snow World, if you look it up, is a game that people can play, so they could be playing hockey or throwing snowballs. And in that environment, they're imagining a whole different, not the heat and all the things that went along with the burns, but a completely different environment. And they've been able to reduce the morphine levels in patients, which actually helps them recover more quickly to get them off that. And so it's an example of, you know, if you went in and said a game for that, it's a serious business. But you can gamify anything.
Yeah. Yep. And we could align with things that already have a lot of energy. But yes, I mean, you add a VR or an AR component to that experience for the students, or for the not the students, but the burn victims who are in that, and all of a sudden, yes, that distraction. Uh,
It is a virtual experience for them. It's an embedded experience. Our stuff is not yet. We're trying to keep it really simple and accessible to people because we don't think that technology is there yet to be able to do that. Although I've talked to a lot of VR, and of course Microsoft's heavily into the augmented. That I think that's probably going to be the way it's going to go. VR will be kind of the stepping stone to that.
well, when we get the holodeck, that'll be
Yep.
that'll be awesome.
Yep. It's coming, I'm sure. It's probably here already. We don't know it. So.
Bruce, I want to honor your time, and we've been going for about 40 minutes. So thank you so much. I always end off the podcast by just asking guests what they're listening to, what they're streaming, what they're reading. It could have to do with leadership. It doesn't have anything to do with leadership. What has caught your attention in recent months?
Well, I'm a Blink addict, so I've been listening to Blinks. So lots of different books. The series I listened to a couple days ago at the gym was about how do societies become totalitarian. And what they do is they do like a 3 minute synopsis, and there's 6 or 7 blinks where you cover maybe 3 or 4 different books or other areas, domains of knowledge. So I've been really interested in that, and then reading about since I lived in Akron, Ohio, and I came from New York. Bruce Springsteen, the two places he was probably most popular was either New York, New Jersey, or Cleveland. Very, very popular. And we've always been big fans of him, but reading his biography. So I read a lot of biographies of people because it's interesting. Also, colleagues at Door Institute down at Rice University. They just put together a book called The Leadership Reckoning, which I think it's getting a lot of, I would say press, like national press, but it will because it's challenging the assumption that we actually develop leaders when we say it's in our mission. And so, it's like prove it. So I think I'm on the faculty advisory board for it, and I've always been a proponent. If we say we're doing it, we should be measuring how we're doing it. And that's Tom Kolditz, who I had met at West Point actually when he was there in the behavioral science department. But so those are the kind of things I'm looking at right now.
Yeah, and I think I took a look last summer for a paper. It was 23 of 25 of the top business schools. So, that we develop leaders. It's in the mission, vision, or their core principles. And I haven't seen the data yet from, that's backing up a lot of those assertions and how it's defined even, right? One class, really? That one class develops the leaders? Wow, that's great.
Usually what the deans would, and many of them are admitting this, usually what they will say is this is what we offer, whether it has the effects we think it has. By the way, it's not just the business schools, it's also the universities. Most universities say that in their mission, they're developing leaders. And that may be true, but in what ways? And they're taking a slice of it at Rice, and the door is John and Ann Door, so they have endowed this initiative with quite a bit of money. This is one of many things they're doing. Actually, they're taking a coaching approach.
Yeah, I read that.
So it's about a third of the students now opt into coaching, and opt-in is important because they want to do it, or they feel it's important to do for whatever reason.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much for your time today. I hope you come back We can talk. We can go deep into gamification. Literally, as we are finishing this podcast, my son has gotten downstairs. He started his 2 hours, and he's now coordinating teams in the other room.
Right.
I kid you not. I mean, talk about sticky. That is sticky. And if we could combine that with some learning and some intentionality around how they're behaving to coordinate their teams, that would be really cool stuff. That would be really cool stuff.
I bet you no one in the house had to tell him to do that.
No, that was it's 3:19. In fact, he's a little early because it's supposed to start at 3:30.
Yeah, I'm sure he's like that around his homework as well, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for all you do, sir. Thank you for the influence you've had on me, that you've had on scores and scores and scores of scholars, and your work is just it's a wealth. It's a wealth, and I just really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Looking at the long lens of how humans develop and grow and take on new and different perspectives, see a larger perspective outside of maybe what Keegan would call level 2, that really is inwardly focused and what's best for me. And how do we help human beings travel through those transitions? People like Bob Keegan, Carl Kunert, Eigel, and of course, here we have Bruce Avolio in this conversation spoke with Susan Murphy about the lifespan last year, David Day. This is a hot topic, and it's an important topic, because if we can figure out how to help humans learn, develop, and grow, and when we say develop, develop, and every one of us, I think that's a part of the work. And it's a part of the work for very, very important reasons, because if you have someone working out of that level 2, that's going to be a difficult leader to work with or for. And Jonathan Reams had mentioned a book called The Map, and I'm going to put that in the show notes for this episode as well. But I think it's critical. I think it's a really, really important piece of this whole conversation about developing leaders and leadership. And I would encourage listeners to purchase that book. And I'm going to try to get the authors onto Phronesis and have a conversation, because I think it's a very, very important conversation to have. The other thing that I'm reflecting on from our conversation was this whole notion of gamification, using game theory or gaming. Bruce called them gamulations. I think that's wonderful. And I see the energy and the enthusiasm my son has for that space. How do we leverage that? How do we leverage that natural energy for that space in a certain population, obviously, but use that as an impetus for learning? Because I think it's a ripe space for learning. You have individuals who are working in teams, and there's an opportunity there to utilize and explore gaming, gamification, simulation, immersive experiences in all kinds of different ways. So as you can tell, my mind is swimming. I'm thinking a lot, reflecting a lot, exploring a lot, and I hope each of you are as well. Thanks, as always, for listening. Take care. Be well. You, my friend, have just finished another episode of Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. To get in touch with me, visit www.scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I can also be found on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Now, if you have feedback, I would love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening to Phronesis. If you like Phronesis, I have a second podcast. It's called the Captovation Podcast. That's with an O, Captovation Podcast, where I speak with experts on the topic of designing and delivering incredible presentations. And now, Kate's twin sister, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.